In progress.
All right. Well, welcome once again to the Spooning a Bear Book Club. I think
I
this
think
is session number 3. I gotta mute a few people. Um, this is session number 3, and so we're going to be talking about chapters 6, 7, and 8, which one of the chapters, the neonates, which we'll start out with, it was chapter 6, was probably one of my greatest experiences when I was working at the Bear Center. So it was a long chapter. It was divided up into 3 parts, but let me quick click over to my slides so you guys can get a better feel of what it looked like, what it felt like when we were doing bear rehab in the late 1990s. So chapter 6 is about the neonates. Now, when the Bear Center was first set up, we were pretty much designed to take in orphaned cubs. You pretty much less than a year old. And typically, when you receive orphan cubs, they're already outside of the den walking around. They may be 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds. They're pretty young bears, but they're pretty much bears already. And they look like bears, they act like bears, they're just very small. What people have to understand is bears aren't born that big. When they are born, they're typically born in the den with the mom, and they're pretty tiny. They're usually around less than a half a pound when they're born. They're mostly hairless. They develop the hair pretty quick. Their eyes are closed, and so when they're born in the den, you have to understand mom's in the middle of her hibernation and understanding that bears wake up routinely when they hibernate. And my next chapter will actually explain that a little bit more. But when mom gives birth to her cubs, they're extremely tiny animals and they depend on mom. So she's sleeping quite a bit. She will wake up to occasionally clean them, but those cubs literally have one job to crawl up onto the mom, latch onto her breast, and literally nurse off of her for the next couple of months until they emerge from the den sometime around mid to late April. So, most of the time, if something were to happen to that bear, to the mother bear, or to one of her cubs, we will never know about it because those bears are tucked away in a den and we'll never find out about it, unfortunately. But that's nature. Things that happen in nature, we tend to let them go. And so we weren't really, in the very beginning, we weren't really planning on getting these neonates, these really young, tiny bears that typically would be in the den with their mom. And so this story started out when we received a call from the North Carolina Wildlife Commission, and they called me up and they told me about an incident that occurred on the eastern coast of North Carolina. And believe it or not, North Carolina's got a lot of bears. They got a ton of bears in the western portion near the Smokies, but they also have a lot of bears in that eastern portion near the ocean. And this particular event occurred in New Bern, North Carolina. And so what had happened was a logger was cutting down a tree. He cut down the tree, did not realize that there was a mother bear with 3 brand new baby bear cubs hibernating in that tree. That event alone was enough to scare the mama away. And to the credit of the logger, he tried leaving them alone, hoping mom would come back, but she didn't come back. And so the North Carolina Wildlife Agency scrambled to try to do something with these cubs, and they placed a call to the Bear Center, and this was back, I believe, 1999. And they were able, I got more people. Tori, if you could keep an eye on who's got their microphone open, that'd be good.
Okay.
So they were able to get those cubs over to me at the Bear Center. And guess what, folks? I had no idea what to do with them. So if you see this picture, this is what the cubs look like. Actually, this is actually a week or so after I received them. And so this is kind of what they look like. Were still pretty hairless. If it looks like they're just sitting on a towel in an aquarium, it wasn't so much an aquarium It was a little plastic box. This is when the cub was a little bit older, but when I say that the Bear Center did not have much of a facility, did not have much equipment, I wasn't kidding. And so we were caring for these neonatal cubs in the back bedroom of a single wide trailer. And so it involved learning on the fly. If you joined us a little earlier, Greg and I were discussing about what we were feeding them at the time. It was more or less a puppy milk replacer. And so the thing is, we're pretty much not set up to handle these bears. And so what was decided and what is absolutely best for these neonates is not to be raised by humans because as you can imagine, with this amount of contact, they are going to imprint and habituate and really get used to being fed by humans if we continue this bottle feeding. So the goal here was more or less to keep these neonates alive and to find wild bear mothers who we could then foster the cubs out to them and let a wild bear mother raise them. And so it was, like I said, it was one of the funnest experience. It was one of the scariest experience since we had never done this. And thankfully, I had tremendous support from the board back then, also from the UT vet school. So Dr. Ramsey was really helping us out, trying to figure out what we needed to feed these bears. But for the most part, not many people raise little tiny bear cubs like this. And so if you read in the book, one of the things that I had to learn really quickly, and this picture shows it off the best, you look at their feet, all four of their feet, they have five toes with five razor blades on them. They are extremely sharp. They're cute as all get out, but you really have to learn how to hold these cubs. Because when I first started, I was laying the cub along my forearm, and the bear, these little tiny cubs, when they're in the den, what they'll do is it looks like they're swimming or treading water. And what that action does, it stimulates the mom to release more milk so the cub keeps feeding for as long as it needs to. And so I was getting all scratched up. And thankfully, we learned after a short period of time different ways to hold the cub. Now, one thing to remember, these are not little baby humans. You don't tilt them on their back and feed them like you would a human infant. They pretty much have to be sternal, which means they have to be on their chest because that's how they would typically feed on their mom. They would lay on their mom's chest in that position and drink milk from her. So we had a number of volunteers that helped. You can only imagine how many people were lining up at the door to volunteer to help feed these bear cubs. But it was round the clock feeding. Typically, every 4 hours, we would be giving them some type of nourishment. And so it was a constant stream of volunteers helping us out. Obviously, my wife and I, we kind of took care of the night shift and most of the day, but we had plenty of support, and it was a pretty wonderful experience. Now, I will tell you, after learning about how sharp their claws are and how quickly they can scratch you up, the other thing we learned is these cubs really know how to suck. That is what they are designed to do. And so they will latch on, they will grab your finger, and they'll try to nurse it. And if you've never heard it before, I know Greg and Tori and some of the other folks that work at the center, the bears, when they're content and they're feeding and they're happy, they will hum. And it's the coolest sound. I don't know, is there a special term for that sound?
We say trilling. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
the
I've always heard it
technical
called
term.
drilling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. It's if you ever get a audio recording of it, it is the most satisfying sound when you're worried about these bears and they start trilling, knowing that they're content and they're fat and happy. And so it was really good to have the cubs making those noises. But like I said, you had to be real careful because those those bears would latch onto anything. And I think my wife had an unfortunate incident where she had to go to work with a bear hickey on her neck. But you had to point their lips in the right direction in order to get them where they needed to be. Another thing we learned from taking care of these bears for the first time was, believe it or not, much like a human baby, it was a really good idea to burp them. If they gulp that milk too fast, maybe the milk we were feeding might not have had the right consistency, and if they drink too fast, they're going to get air in their gut. So we would often try to burp them. You didn't once in a while you would hear it, but we had to make sure that we didn't have too much air in their digestive system. And so you never dreamed you'd ever be burping a baby bear cub, but there we were. And so lastly, the other thing that Dr. Ramsey had to teach us is typically in the den, um, the mom would lick them clean. She would take care of them. She wakes up periodically, and by licking them, sometimes she stimulates them to defecate, and sometimes sometimes they'll go on their own. But when they haven't gone in a while, you could take a warm washcloth and rub their genital areas, and usually they'll release all over the place. And it's very loose and very yellow and green depending on um, like how much they ate the feeding before. And obviously, when you're trying to stimulate them to go to the bathroom, they will latch on and feed on your finger again, even though you're not producing milk out of your finger. So it was a learning experience. It was wonderful. We were only doing this a couple of weeks, and while we were caring for these bears, we had some wonderful folks, researchers out in various portions of the state looking for surrogate mothers, trying to find mothers in the den that had just given birth that could potentially adopt these cubs. And so it was pretty much a waiting game. And it was one that we hoped to find these, and we hoped and prayed, but it's a hard thing. You have to understand that way back then in the 1990s, the radio collars that we had were sometimes very difficult to locate. They weren't these GPS collars now that you could just call up on the computer and get a good idea where that bear is. The collars back then, we had to use an antenna and triangulate and do a lot of hiking, backcountry stuff. This is why if Jay Clark joins us, he was one of the heroes of the time back then because he did a lot of the bear work for Dr. Pelton. Anyway, we finally got a call, the first call after a couple of weeks, and it was a call from uh, Frank Van Manen and Joe Clark. They were working with another biologist in the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. They had a fledgling bear population. If you know where that is, that's up on the Cumberland Plateau, closer to the Kentucky border. They had a fledgling bear population, and one of the biologists, Leslie Morgan, at the time located a den with a female in it that had a couple of cubs. And so they invited us to go out there so we can foster out one of these bears. Now, for those of you that don't know, Frank Van Manen is the gentleman on the left. Joe Clark is the gentleman on the right. If anyone is
Dang, that's Joe Clark.
Joe Clark, not Jay Clark,
That
Joe
blows my.
Clark.
No, that's Joe. Yeah, that blows my mind. I can't imagine he looked like that 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, Frank Van Manen is now the lead of the interagency grizzly bear team in the West. I don't know if he recently retired or not, but he went on to.
Yeah, I think I heard I think he retired this
Yeah,
year,
yeah, I'm pretty
actually.
sure he
Yeah.
did, but he was leading the grizzly bear recovery in the greater Yellowstone area. So now understand the next couple of pictures are kind of a hodgepodge of the three different releases. But what we do is we would actually hike out to the den and we'd sedate the mother. This is actually, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank.
It's Chuck. It's Chuck Hester.
Chuck Hester from the National Park Service. I had a good picture of them crawling into a den.
Yeah.
Um, and so they would sedate the mother, and oftentimes they would pull her out because they would want to do different studies on her. They'd want to get her weight, some hair samples, maybe some blood, pull a tooth if they never pulled a tooth. And so they would do the full biological workup again. Oftentimes they would replace that radio collar because those batteries only lasted less than a couple of years. And so whenever they would get the hands on the bear, they would either replace the collar or remove it if they were done with the study. And so what we do is we would then pull out the mom and all of the cubs that she had given birth to. And what we do when we were getting ready to put her back in the den, and some people say this isn't necessary, but I think it's a really good extra step to take. But we would take her natural cubs and the orphan cub, and we'd only, just so you know, we'd only give her one extra cub. It would be too much of a burden her to if we were to give her like two or three extra cubs, the likelihood of all those cubs surviving would drop considerably. And so we'd only foster out one orphaned cub to a wild surrogate mother. And so before we would put all the cubs back in the den, we would take Vicks Vapor Rub, and I'm sure most people know it's a very menthol, minty smelling medicine, and we would place that Vicks Vapor Rub and we would smear it on the cub's head. And we would do that for all of her natural cubs as well as the orphaned cub. That does a couple of things. First off, it makes sure every cub smells exactly alike. So when mom wakes up, she kind of is waking up out of that sedation. She's going to smell the cubs. They're all going to smell alike. They're all going to smell minty and tasty. And so she's going to lick that Vicks Vapor Rub off of the cubs. And by licking that clean from the cubs, she's putting her scent back onto them. So she does it with all her natural cubs as well as the orphan. And so she licks that orphan cub clean. And as far as she can tell, it's one of hers. And so it was pretty awesome. That was, just so you know, that was Jake Clark's beard. But this is Frank Van Manen administering the Vicks Vapor Rub on some of her natural cubs. There's a young Jay Clark. He was man. I went on a number of uh, adventures with him, either looking for collars or looking for bear dens, and he could hike like no other. I could not keep up with that guy. Anyway, when we were all done with the study, we'd obviously make sure that new collar was fitted. We'd take the natural cubs and the orphan cub and the mom, and we'd put them all back in the den. We'd stuff them back in. I had to repeat this photo because I didn't have a good one. But here's a good shot at us placing one of the orphans on the mother as we're getting ready to leave. And the cool thing is, this was one of the parting shots. All the bears were cuddled up in the mother's within the mother's arms, and we pretty much tucked them in. We bid them farewell, and then from that point forward, that mom is raising that orphan cub. And so it was an amazing experience. I kind of wanted to ask Greg and Tori, have you guys been fostering any cubs out? I know back in the late 90s, Dr. Pelton had a number of collared bears in his studies, so we had more options back then. Do you guys ever still foster?
Yeah, yeah, we do. Actually, was it 19, Katrina? We just looked today. And I think we have fostered out 19 throughout the history of
Wow.
ABR. And Greg and I, was it 2 years ago now? Was the most recent one.
Uh, it was before I left the Park Service,
Yeah,
February of 24, no, 20, February
23,
24.
the
No,
fourth. Yeah.
24. We fostered because that was that cub that came in January. That was the youngest cub you've ever seen. They were a week
Yeah, it
old.
was Nibbles and Bits. It was Bits for
They-
those who
Yeah,
know and followed and know the name. But
yeah. Daryl, I don't know if you followed along with that winter of 24. There were some cubs brought to ABR on January 22nd, was it, Tori?
yeah, it was really
Right.
early.
And
That's
they were
true.
probably born within days, and only one of the four was even able to make it. They were in the ICU at UT, and they just couldn't get them to nurse without aspirating, and they got infections, pneumonia, and said only one of them pulled through. But the one that pulled through, we fostered to a sow with three cubs, and she still had all four with them. The last we saw her late last year. So. Yeah, that was the last one.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I'm glad to hear that because it would be near impossible not to imprint on them if they're
Yeah.
raised, if they're bottle fed. and we've had a number of cubs come to us that have been bottle fed illegally because
Right.
however they
Yeah.
acquired them, and
Yeah.
it's really difficult to break them of that habit. So
Yeah.
I also like to tell people, Daryl, that realistically, we do our best, and we have an ICU, we have year or round the clock care, but we're not a mother bear.
right.
Like we just can't give them the care that they really need, even if
Yeah.
One,
it's literally the milk that they're getting.
yeah,
So
no, 100%. So I'm glad to hear that you still have the options of fostering out to
Yeah. It's
certain.
there's less callers out there on females as candidates these days. So
Yep.
we had some good ones. When I was in the park, we fostered a couple in my time, and we had GPS collars on some females for a conflict study that wasn't a great candidate, for fostering because they were conflict females, but we used one of them actually 2 years in a row, and she never got into conflict again that we knew of after we fostered to her. So she wasn't that bad of a conflict bear either. She was really not a bad
Yeah.
one. But we did probably no more than two ever was the most we put with a den. I think we did give a female who had two. We gave her two others one
Yeah.
time.
Sometimes you don't have many options,
Yeah,
so you just hope
yeah.
for the best.
And is the den accessible? We had some dens that were in trees that were, the hole was 80 feet up, and Ryan Williamson, he loves climbing trees, and we could get to the hole, but then the tree was hollow all the way down to the bottom, and so there was no getting to the bear.
Yeah.
So we had some tree dens we couldn't use, but we've got people now. Unfortunately, some of these photographers, they're stalking bears in Cades Cove like crazy. But it's come in handy because they've known where their dens are at,
Yeah.
when we've needed them. So it's kind of, good. It's more bad than good in my opinion, but it has worked in our favor.
No, I totally understand that. Um, in case anyone's wondering, it would be amazing if we had a way of marking these cubs to track them to know how well they did. But as you can imagine, a cub that small is going to grow really, really quickly. So you can't put a miniature collar on them. You don't want to put an ear tag in an ear that's only the size of your pinky fingernail. And so it was difficult. We did try to tattoo one, but it was just very difficult to do. So our thoughts, and I firmly believe this, when I released the bear, I kind of didn't want to hear about, like, I wanted to know if it did well, but it was like it's a wild bear again, and whatever happens in the wild happens for a reason. And so we put these cubs out, and oftentimes we just hope for the best, and that's the best we can do.
Daryl, I have something to say there. We had from Alabama, two cubs, Aubie and Big Al, for those who know the names, but they were fostered out and they were doing a study on, their bear population because it's fairly small. And they did put those, I think they're just the expandable collars that rot off or break
Yeah.
off. I don't know, Greg, if you know, but
Yeah, they're the ones with they're like a little
like for
elastic thing, and they have a
fawns.
cotton. There's a cotton spacer. The cotton spacer kind of erodes and corrodes and
Yeah,
disintegrates and stuff.
we used those collars with the cotton spacer with Jay Clark studied, because
Yeah,
he tracked 11 of our cubs, but those cubs were generally bigger, like 40
right.
pounds when we were releasing them. So something this small
Yeah,
would be difficult because they can grow
and
really
those,
fast.
yeah, those Alabama Cubs weren't they fostered in April, Tori, or something? It was
Yeah,
kind of late.
they were larger. They were
Yeah,
fostered out, but what I was gonna say is that the biologist in Alabama did get back to us. They are doing like a whole study again, like I said, on their population, and a grad student kept collaring actually the female cub and found her a year, 2 years later,
three
and
years, three three
three
years
years,
later. She's 3 years.
3 years later,
Yeah,
and beautiful big bear. And so at least that's one that I know for sure, was fostered successfully, left the den, and then went on to be a bear.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's great to hear. And so yeah, when I released bears, it was like I didn't care if I never heard from them again. I just hoped and pretended that they just grew up and were big,
yeah.
happy, healthy bears.
hmm
Well, and I can say, Daryl, from being in the park for 9 years with a lot of ABR bears in the landscape, I caught maybe three in my time in the park, maybe four, and even the ones I caught were not really ones that you needed to catch it. Sometimes it was just they showed up in a trap in a picnic area, and it wasn't even the bear you're looking
Yeah.
for. But you know, we would have known if we were having problems from them, and we would have if they got road killed, we knew about it. If they got harvested, we knew about it because we had ear tags on all the released ones, you know. But as far as the fostered ones, we would usually tag the mother so
Yeah.
that at least if we did see the mom again and we knew it was her and she had all the cubs that she should have, we knew that the foster cub was making it, you know, in that
Yeah.
same year. That's about the best we could do to know that.
Well, I think one of the greatest experiences I had, and I'm forgetting the bear's name, but it had a surgery, it had a broken leg, had a shaved back end. It was not Houdini, it was a different bear that had a broken leg, and they mended that broken leg, and he had a super long suture mark on his back leg, but the bottom half of this bear was shaved bald. And we released that bear. Oh, its name was Hyatt. We released that bear back in Hyatt Lane in Cades Cove. And I remember it was a few months after we released it. I took a ride through Cades Cove, and sure enough, I see a gentleman like with his binoculars looking up at a tree. And I pulled over. I'm like, "You see something?" He's like, "There's a bear up there, but it looks like it's naked out of." And it was just a cool feeling knowing that he was it was only a couple months after I released them, but it was like, yeah, I cared for that bear. So anyway, all right. Any questions from the audience regarding the neonates?
No, not that I, nope, not that I see.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump. The chapter 7 was only like a page and a half. It was just the make-believe story of what I imagine a bear would do when it's getting ready for that winter slumber that they have. But I figured I would take this time, and boy, I hope Greg doesn't like contradict me here. But one of my pet peeves is I see more and more and more people, especially on social media, saying, "Oh, bears in the Smokies don't hibernate." There is such a confusion regarding bear hibernate because when you say bears don't hibernate, many people automatically assume that they're up all year long. You can see them any time of the year. And there have been people like planning trips to go to the Smokies in January and February wanting to know where to see the bears because they heard bears don't hibernate. And it's an unfortunate miscommunication with some nerdy scientific terms. And so trying to straighten this up, when it comes to hibernation, there's like three definitions you can look at. You can ask a 10-year-old child, what does hibernation mean? And most of them will say sleeping through the winter. If you look in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it's going through the winter in a dormant or a torpid state, and I'll come back to that word torpid. Or the scientific definition of hibernation is when you slow down these metabolic processes to conserve energy for you to survive long periods without food. And so it doesn't matter if you use the kids definition, the Merriam-Webster definition, or the scientific definition, bears hibernate. Now, there's different ways in which an animal can hibernate. One of the ways is the strategy called true hibernation, where their heart rate decreases, their respiration rate decreases, and their temperature decreases to just above freezing. That is like called deep hibernation or this true hibernation. There's another form of hibernation which is called torpor, which bears use, a couple other animals use as well, and their heart rate decreases, their breathing rate decreases, but their body temperature only drops about 10 degrees. So instead of dropping to, say, high 30s or low 40-degree body temperature, their body temperature may drop to upper 80s or lower 90s. It's still a decrease. It still fits all the scientific definitions of hibernation. But because of that elevated body temperature, bears can wake up quickly. That is why when you go to a den site, you can disturb a female bear. She could wake up. She might be real groggy, but they can wake up really quickly. And so one of the things I always try to correct when I see it on social media is when people get on there and say, "Oh, bears in the Smokies don't hibernate." That provides some really bad directions for people that don't know because they think bears are up and walking about. Now, I will tell you when you're talking about that scientific definition where it's surviving long periods without food, in urban areas like Gatlinburg, where bears have free access to food almost all year long, they may not sleep much. They may have a den that they go back to, but they may get up quite frequently because there's food around. Typically, though, the bears in the wild, like deep in the park or deep in the Cherokee National Forest or Nantahala National Forest, where there's not much food, you have to understand, even there, there's no grasses growing, no new vegetation growing. Most of the trees lose all their leaves. There's hardly any food out there for bears. So they have to conserve their energy and they go to sleep for long periods of time. Now, it could be a couple of months. If it's a real light winter, it could be maybe a month or so. But they do shut their bodies down to conserve energy during the wintertime. So if you hear someone say bears don't hibernate, let them know that bears are one of the most prolific, highly adapted hibernating animals because they conserve energy with such a large body. They're phenomenal with their energy conservation. So um,
Hey,
I
Daryl, we
yeah,
had
there's a couple questions.
yeah, is hibernation different between bear species and then, for example, bears in Alaska versus Tennessee?
Great question, Lisa. No, absolutely not. A black bear in Alaska hibernates the exact same way as a black bear in Tennessee or Florida. It could be very different in the duration, but they still use that strategy called torpor, where they decrease their respiration rate, their heart rate, their body temperature still remains relatively high, but they even though their body temperature drops 10 degrees, they're burning 75% less energy when they're in that torpid state. And so it doesn't matter Alaska, Tennessee, they're doing the exact same strategy. The main difference between those two areas is the amount of time they spend in that torpid state. In Tennessee, they might do it for a month or two, maybe three. In Alaska, it'll likely be more like 4, 5, 6 months that they're in their den. And I believe there was another question.
It's Mary Lou Kopensky. She's
Oh,
thanking you for rescuing her during a Facebook debate.
oh, I will have people argue with me all the time. But I'm sure Greg, you can attest. You've
oh
been to
yeah,
bears and den sites all the time.
yeah, you know, what you just said, I have this conversation with folks a lot, and I generally get pretty good reactions from it, right? When people ask about, I heard they don't hibernate here, and they say, oh, the bears here aren't really hibernating, and I have the same explanation you had. I probably say the same thing word for word. I probably stole it from you by hearing you say it at some point in time, but yeah, I tell people like, hey, look, they're so good at conserving energy that yeah, if there's no food, they can go into that den a lot earlier. But if there's great food, they can stay up and moving. They're still always going to slow down. And one of the things I learned from a veterinarian, actually, Dr. Ramsey was telling me about this same stuff too. I was talking to them about this one time. He said that even in captivity, those bears that are getting food all the time still go into torpor. It doesn't matter, if you give them a ton of food, and we see that at ABR, right? When we've
Yep.
had cubs over the winter that are plenty fat enough, they go into torpor, and we could give them all the food in the world. They'll still lay around for about 20 of the 24 hours in a day.
Yep.
And so even a captive bear, with all the food in the world and the warmest environment still goes through that cycle. And, the hormonal interactions that trigger that, lean mass preservation is being studied by some researchers, I think, in Washington still. They're trying to figure out how the bear preserves that, lean muscle and bone mass during torpor, because it's really impressive, right? If you laid down for 2 weeks, you'd turn to jelly, I mean, you wouldn't be able to walk 3 weeks of bed rest. Your muscles would atrophy so quickly, but a bear can I've seen a bear pop out of a den. I've busted one out of a den before that we thought would have cubs and she didn't. And when we snuck up on the den, she blew out of there and took off. And it was in the snow.
Um, just so you know, Jay Clark has joined us.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw Jay's in here, so he may want to comment. I sent him a screenshot of the picture of him from
The young Jay
your
Clark.
slide earlier. Yeah, so yeah.
We'll come back after I get through this last chapter, and then we can show that picture of Jay Clark again and have him chime in. So anyway, I just want to give a brief description of this whole bears hibernation, the call of the den. Like I said, it was just a romantic image of how bears will eventually pick their den site and kind of lay down for the winter. So that leads to the last chapter for today, which is about Timber and Blaze. And this was such a cool story. I feel like I say every chapter I write about is like the coolest story, but this one was truly unique. It was the first time that we were called about some older cubs from another state. This was actually a call came in from Arkansas, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. David Goad, who was their bear biologist at the time, called and told me a story about these two cubs, and the story of those cubs what made it so remarkable. And so, as the story was related to me, there was some jerk poacher that ended up killing a mother bear, and his goal was to try to capture the mother's young cubs. And there's two of them. They were probably 15 pounds each. And both of the cubs, after the mother was killed, both of the cubs did what they instinctively do, and they climbed to the top of a tree. Well, this bozo goes ahead and cuts down the tree trying to capture these bears. As you can imagine, falling out of a large tree that's cut down will lead to injury, possibly. Fortunately, the male cub survived the fall without hardly any injuries at all, but the female cub ended up shattering both of her femurs. And so, how they got the story out of that guy, how they caught the guy, I do not know, but I'm just so thankful that they did catch him. And so, in the meantime, while they were dealing with this poacher, David Goad asked if we could possibly do something for these cubs. It was a major news story in Arkansas, and they wanted to do whatever they could to save these bears. And so they sent them to the Bear Center. And as soon as we received these cubs, it took a while. You have to understand there's a lot of paperwork to be done, a lot of communication that has to take place between wildlife agencies. And it took a while for us to get our hands on these bears. And so it was probably close to a week before we were able to receive both of these bears from Arkansas. And as soon as we did, we took both cubs to the University of Tennessee. Once again, Dr. Ramsey took the lead and examined them. The male cub, like I said, was in really good health. The female cub, he had horrible news. Because of the length of time it was from the initial injury to the time he was able to examine him, when they x-rayed the female's back legs, the two femur bones were lying side by side, and they already began to fuse together. And so they were not comfortable trying to separate them because they would likely break them again. And so it formed a callous enough structure that it was solidifying. It was healing, but it was healing in an awkward way. And so Dr. Ramsey didn't really know what to do. He gave the bear back to us, gave us a bunch of medicine to take care of any infection, to lower the pain. And he said, let's just keep the bear confined for a while until we see what happens with her legs. And so when we received her in, um, her legs were really crooked. We did not want her climbing too much. And so, again, the Bear Center at that time wasn't really equipped. We had these large half-acre pens. We had a couple of smaller enclosures that we kind of had to construct on the fly. And it looked similar to this. This wasn't the actual one we used for timber or for blaze, but we had an enclosure inside the main enclosure. that we can confine the cub. So it really restricted her climbing and her movements. And so if you look at that, pretty strong structure, and you see those white little tubes, what those tubes did is they led to outside the bear den. So we can still feed the bears without the bears seeing humans. And so that's what it looked like from the inside of the pen. And this was my feeding station from outside of the pen. So obviously, really small type of food bits. Sometimes I'd have to wash them down the tube, make sure they made it all the way to her enclosure, but it worked great. And after a couple of weeks, she was getting pretty rambunctious. She was eating, she was moving around. Her brother, Timber, was on the outside of the cage, but still in the main enclosure, and they would interact all the time. He would come by and they would squawk at each other and as like brother and sisters getting in their typical daily fights. And the thing I noticed is, man, she was climbing all over the inside of that smaller cage. I told Dr. Ramsey, and he more or less said, "Have at it. Let's see what she does." And so we ended up releasing her into the large enclosure with her brother. And albeit her legs were crooked, but it was pretty amazing because she was able to jump around and climb just as well as her brother. If they stood side by side, you can see her decreased stature because of her broken back legs, but she was just as active, just as fast, just as rambunctious as her brother. And we had them, I think, less than 2 months, or maybe right around 2 months. And I called up Arkansas and I said, "Come pick up your cubs. They're ready." And they were pretty flabbergasted that we were able to not only nurse them back to health, but the fact that the female bear was also going to be released along with her brother. So that was the story of Timber and Blaze. That was a pretty unique experience and just really goes to show the resiliency of these young wild animals or kids in general. So, any questions about Timber and Blaze?
I'd love to see the X-rays on that. I wonder if those
I I
are
did-
any.
I
Yeah,
I wish I looked through all the files. I remember seeing the X-rays because the
yeah,
bones were laying kind of side by side.
yeah. Overlapped. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and so it formed a big callus um, structure there, and they didn't want to re-break them because they didn't know how the bones would re-break. So
yeah.
anyway, if there's no questions about Timber and
I
Blaze,
I I got one. What
sure.
time of year was that? Just I'm just curious. What
It,
what
it
time of
was it
year?
was during the summer.
Other summer? Yeah, it's like a midsummer.
Yeah,
Bear.
early summer we
Yeah,
got the
yeah.
bears. They were pretty small. I think she was about
Yeah.
15 pounds or
So
so when
they
we
were
got
they
her.
were healthy for their size and stuff. They were good
Yep,
cubs for the
yep.
year. Yeah,
And
yeah. Well,
back then we were like soon as they were hitting about 40 pounds, we were trying to get them back out the door.
yeah.
So we did not
And
hold
Daryl,
bears too long.
in Arkansas, did they actually bring bears into Arkansas to bolster their population? Was that like a genetic thing they were worried about having too few bears and they brought some in, or was it a reintroduction? Or I'm
I
just curious.
believe
I've never really known.
I believe they always had bears around the White River Refuge in Arkansas. Whether or not they brought bears in from elsewhere, I do not know.
Okay. Yeah, people have asked me about Arkansas Bears a number of times, and I always kind of guess that either they always had them, but they got down to such a small number and they may have brought some in. I mean, Jay might know this. I think it was the 90s where it got down to like a
Yeah,
critical level. Jay, if you hear me, you want to chime in and tell us about the Arkansas Bears? I know you probably know more than
he's
I
trying to
do.
lay low.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'll have to text
I'm here.
him.
I'm just listening. Hang on a minute. Let me get this crap figured out here.
There you are.
Sorry, my video wasn't working.
Nah.
You know, I'm pretty sure the Ozarks and the Ouachitas maintained a source population.
Did they ever bring bears in to Arkansas from like Michigan or somewhere in the Midwest that they
You
that
know,
they
I'm not sure about that.
okay.
I know.
Someone asked me that one time and I thought they knew or they weren't sure, but I never know, the exact answer on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Because Missouri and Mississippi and those other states, they all were extirpated. They didn't have any bears for uh the last 20 years in those states. Louisiana and Arkansas were the only I believe, Midwest states to have bears in the upper Midwest before some expansions and stuff.
Yeah, I just don't know of many states bringing bears, especially bringing bears from other states in. I know.
Yeah, I thought they may have in Arkansas. I know Missouri now has a healthy bear population, and Mississippi's got bears again from
Yep.
Louisiana and other places, and there's some connectivity there. I just wasn't sure if Arkansas ever did bring bears in. I think Louisiana did. Someone in the chat says uh,
It was like a
they
trade.
brought bears. They brought bears from the Midwest. Minnesota got turkeys in return. So maybe there was a turkey for bears exchange from Minnesota to Arkansas. Maybe.
It very well could have been because when I was with TWRA, we would trade turkeys with Texas for. I'm trying to remember. Oh, I think they just paid us for the turkeys, but we had an excess of turkeys at a time, and now they're worried about the turkey population. So it's boom and bust cycles. So well, Jay, glad you can join us. I haven't talked to you in about 20, 30 years, but
It's been a while.
I don't know when you joined in, but we were talking about the neonates and how we fostered them out. And I mentioned I got a photo up there of you in your younger years. You want to describe to folks how you would go about locating some of these the surrogate mothers?
Sure. We had a I was working at the University of Tennessee under Mike Pelton, but also with Frank Van Manen and Joe Clark, and we had a bear research program for over 50 years at UT, and it started in 1968 because TWRA, the state agency, for those of you that may not know that, they were and the Park Service for that matter, they really had no idea how many bears we had in Tennessee. Um, we knew we had a few, but they were in very small pockets, and so that's kind of was the genesis behind that. So how that applies to your question, Daryl, or what you asked me to describe was we for all those years for about almost 50 straight years, we live trapped in the Smokies, at least on the Tennessee side for a population study. And we would, anytime we had an adult female, we tried to put a radio collar on her. Because again, in 1968, not only did we not know how many bears were in Southern Appalachia, but we also didn't really know their basic ecology and things. So, um, the way we found out that they like that the bears in at least in the within the national park den in hollowed out trees that are above ground is because we put radio collars and followed them there.
Yep.
And so we'd put the radio collars on the female, and now with GPS it's a lot easier. But at the time you would jump in a Cessna and fly around, try to get it in the drainage and not throw up while you're looking at a topo map, and then go in on foot and track it to the den. And then once you get there, the ones that we usually fostered cubs to, obviously we would need them to be accessible. So as you can see in those pictures, both those bears were in ground dens, or at least the one on the left
Yep.
is. And you know, that may be a stump, or it may be where a tree fell over and they dug out underneath or what have you. But when we would find a female and uh, had two cubs or less and it was in good shape and we could assess it, that's when we would do the fostering.
Yeah, and
What's the furthest
I
you ever
described.
hike?
What's that now?
I was asking, what's the furthest you ever had to hike to get to a den?
Well, ironically, it's not so much.
Yeah, off trail.
Yeah, I was about to say just being off trail. It really depends on the terrain, but I've left at 6 in the morning and got back at midnight before. So
Yeah,
I don't know
that
how.
sounds right.
Yeah, it's pretty miserable, really. But that was also the important thing is, and what's nice about having the GPS data now, we used to have pay attention to which grad student flew in the plane to locate the bears because some some people were pretty good and some people really sucked. And if they really sucked, and they didn't even get it in the right watershed, well, it made for a really long day.
Greg, if you want to talk later, I got a whole bunch of Jay Clark stories.
Yeah, I've heard he was tough to keep up with
Oh my
in the woods.
gosh.
That
Well,
yeah,
obviously Jay was in a whole lot better shape than I was, and I remember looking for some dropped collars with Jay, and he would drive around. We'd be in my Jeep, and he would triangulate to locate where the collar was, and then he told me to pull over, and he stepped off to the side of the road, and he's like, the collar's down there, and we were sliding on our backside, like
yeah,
catching rhododendrons because it was so steep, and we slid, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 feet down, and we finally located the collar. But then we turned around and we had this mountain to climb straight back up. And I remember Jay pulled out a map and he looked. He's like, "Oh, the Appalachian Trail's at the bottom of this drainage." So we continued going down, so at least we'd have a trail to hike back up. Well, the AT in that part of the Cherokee, I think it was in Cherokee National Forest, is straight up and straight down. And so he's hiking at the same pace, uphill, downhill, doesn't matter. He just goes fast. And I go slow uphill. And so I was looking for a clearing where they can land the helicopter to pick me up. But I threw Jay my keys. I said, I'll meet you at the Jeep. And like I showed up an hour later than he got there. So
yeah.
he was more attuned to hiking in the mountains than I was.
That's why you always packed a cooler back in the day, buddy. But
Yeah.
you know, no, I do remember that trip there.
And then
So
one
Hey,
other
at least
story, and I mentioned it in the book because Jay mentioned it's not so much the distance, but the terrain. Sometimes you got to hike through a tangled mess. And I remember one of the dens you found when we were placing a surrogate mother, you had found it the day before, but you approached the den from the opposite side of the mountain. And so when we were walking to the den with this orphan cub, you were trying to get your bearings to figure out where exactly that den was, and you couldn't find it at first. And then I remember you grabbed my arm and you said, "Keep the cub quiet." He's like, "The den's right there." And in my mind, I could just picture that orphan cub starting a ball, and there's a female bear with her own cubs hearing this squalling cub and me holding a bear. So I was just getting ready to pitch it to you or Dr. Clark or whoever, just play hot potato with that cub if that mama came out. So
yeah,
anyway,
as far as I know, I mean, I know for a fact that at least I had two of the bears that I followed for a couple years that we fostered cubs to, and um, I know for a fact at least one of them, it was successful. Um, and I know we've had other sightings of, other grad students back in the day that were knew it was. So it's great that we have that opportunity to do that. The only, the key to that though is to have at least a handful of females out there with collars on so you can uh do that. So uh I'm hoping UT and Maryville College and Appalachian Bear Rescue get in the bear research business a little bit at some point, because with the GPS technologies and stuff, it's just a totally different ball game logistics wise.
yep,
well, yeah, Jay, for you guys, followers, listeners who don't know, Dr. Clark here is on our board, and he brings a background that we haven't really had on the board before. But I'm trying to push for GPS collaring female bears from ABR when they're released and tracking them until reproductive success. It'd be a real long-term study. You'd have to do at least 4 years probably to get to confirm in reproductive success, but that's something that we've actually only known in one or two bears from ABR. I know of one female. I rescued her off of Laurel Falls when I was my first year in the Park Service. And if you guys know her, her name was Lucinda Bear. She was at Laurel Falls at the waterfall as a yearling, and we carried her off the trail, brought her to ABR, released her a couple months later in Elkmont, and she has since had three litters of cubs and maybe on her fourth this year, and stayed out of trouble for the most part.
And is
Uh,
at Long Falls still.
living on Laurel Falls Trail, it's pretty hard for a bear to stay out of trouble. So she's actually stayed out of trouble well enough that they've never moved her. and we know of 3 litters and maybe a fourth litter of cubs this year, and she's coming up on 10 years old. So, others are out there for sure. We just don't have the visibility of them. You're not catching them. You're not knowing. So there's one other female that we think was a ABR female that is known to reproduce that had some yellow ear tags that were only on ABR bears at one point in time a couple years ago, and so that's how we knew that one. But otherwise, we don't have a lot of reproductive success from ABR bears, but that'd be a cool thing to track.
There's
So
a
I'm fighting.
I don't know what bear it was, but there was a male bear spotted too. I was telling Katrina about this yesterday, maybe, by a photographer in the act of mating.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah, there's yeah.
but I want to say Charlie or something was
It
its
was
name.
it was Charlie something. Yeah, he was the photographer got good enough pictures you could read his ear tags, and it was an
Yeah,
ABR bear, Gates
a
Cove,
little
who was
bit.
mating. He was
Yeah, male and
breeding
females.
female. So yeah,
Yep.
so we know
We release bears with working pieces in parks.
we know some male bears have at least tried to get it done. So yeah,
Good for
but
Charlie.
yeah, yeah. And I know we're running out of time. Jay, I was just gonna ask you guys, the Bears in Big South Fork, that was what, 96, 95, 96,
It
97,
was
something like that?
96, 97, 98.
Okay, and so there
I'm
was a
pretty, I'm
couple
pretty
of
sure
winters.
that's right. I know it was
And
96, 97.
and they put bears in dens in the winter there, right? Was what they did in Big South Fork
Yeah.
to
So
to
we
move.
we had we had our bears in the park
Acclimation
that,
beds.
we would find as candidates to potentially move. So either females we knew that were pregnant or that already had a litter. And
Had cubs. You moved them with the cubs, right?
yeah, we moved them with the cub. Yeah, cubs.
Yeah.
And then they put them in predetermined dens at the Big South. I was not involved in the Big South Fork Park because I was a few pounds lighter at the time, and I was the one that got stuck down in all the trees and had to put the harness on the female and the cubs in a duffel bag. And um, I've got a couple cool pictures of me down, about 30 something feet down in a hollowed out chestnut oak. Um, you're just really hoping that drug works when you go down in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But no, so we moved them from the park. Then we'd tote them out. They would stay in one of our, transfer cages from the Park Service overnight and be taken up to Big South Fork and drugged again and then taken into those dens to put. And if you did that in the wintertime, they stuck around because they're really good mothers and they're not going to leave
Yeah. The
their
Cubs,
babies.
because the Cubs
But
wouldn't travel with them. They wouldn't. Yeah.
right,
Right.
but
Oh,
the
Yeah.
ones that moved in the summer were not as successful, even
yeah,
if they.
I was going to say a little bit more history about this. The photo up there, that's Leslie Morgan at the time. She was working in Big South Fork. But just so you know, Greg, this photo that I have here regarding these cages, these
Yeah.
prior to them moving the cubs with the females with cubs and placing them in dens, they tried moving some bears earlier and putting them in cages like these acclimation cages, and they held them for a longer period of time in the Big South Fork, and then they would let them go, and the bears would just walk right back to the Smokies. And so
Really. Yeah.
these cages actually came from the Big South Fork when they realized that wouldn't work, and then they changed gears and started moving the females with the cubs.
And
Yeah,
just so you
and
know,
that was
there
kind
we
of part of the study was to compare, whether could you do it. I mean, it's obviously a lot easier to do it in the summer. I mean, you trap a female, take her to the Big South Fork, put her in an acclimation pen, and then let them out. That's a hell of a lot easier, I promise you, than you
Yeah.
know finding a den, hiking 30
yeah.
people in there, and having to bring pulleys and climbing gear and everything else to get those things out and then take them out on a litter, put them in a truck, take I mean, so but the winter release is definitely the way to go. And there, if anybody's interested, there's uh it's not Jay Clark, it's Joe Clark, no relation, but he was in charge of that study. And there's a really good uh paper you could look into if y'all are interested in such thing. Uh,
Yeah.
about
And we
about
still
about the whole
That's
technique.
Joe
And
Clark right here. Different person. That's Joe
yep.
Clark.
Yeah, and we still use those acclamation pens are still in enclosures 1 and 2. Those round acclamation pens are still there. We don't use them a lot, but they're still there to be used when
Yep.
we need them. So
Yep.
it's still getting some use today.
All right. Well, we just hit the hour-long mark, and I promised Tori not to be too long-winded, but I could talk to you guys for like hours if if you let us. So you guys can go to bed on time. I think we'll wrap up the book club part of it, and I can get to my last slide that just says thank you, and we'll see you in 2 more weeks. Obviously, the next couple of chapters are what we're at, and I don't even know what those chapters are, so I got to go back to reading my book. So,
Yeah, and I don't have that pulled up either on my schedule, but it's definitely probably 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, maybe 11. I need to look, but I will send the recording out for those of you who are interested, those who missed it, and thank you guys so much. Thank you, Jay, for joining. That was wonderful.
You bet. Hey,
Um,
thanks. And it's chapters, because I'm looking at Greg's text he sent me. It's chapters 9, 10, and 11 on October the 15th. Those are
Perfect.
pages 64 to 78 for those of you that cannot remember chapter numbers.
Thank you so much, Jay.
All
Thank you
right.
guys. Thank you, Daryl. And just a lot of comments saying thank you. So everybody, I hope you have a great night and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Daryl, I hope to catch up with you soon, buddy.
sounds good, Jay. Take it
All
easy.
right. Take
See
care.
you guys.
See y'all.